and welcome to Wide Angle this week. It's been just a few days since the worst terror attack in Kashmir killed over 40 CRPF Jawans while travelling in a convoy from Jammu to Srinagar on Thursday, the 14th of February. A young boy from a local village not far from where the convoy was struck in South Kashmir was radicalized over a period of a year, that's what intelligence agencies seem to gather, and drove a car laden with explosives into this convoy. How did he get radicalized? What led him to commit this act? What was the involvement of the Pakistan-based Jaish-e-Mohammed in this entire process? What can India do? Some very important questions that need answers right now. We're joined by senior journalist and author David Devdas, who has written two recent books on Kashmir. One, The Story of the Conflict in the Valley, and the second, also very critically, on this generation of rage that he calls these young men and women in the valley. David, thanks very much for being on the show today. I think everyone's really shaken by what we've seen in Jammu and Kashmir over the course of the last few days. But for people who've been watching the valley over the last few years, perhaps, since let's take Burhan Wani's encounter and the killing as a marker in the calendar of the Kashmir conflict. Since July 2016, those who have been observing what's been going on the ground have been afraid of something like this.
Indeed. In fact, I started pointing out the fact that a new generation has taken the lead from about 2010. You remember there were massive stone pelting agitations in 2010, and it is then that I decided to start writing this book, and I started research, and it's in 2011 that I went around to 60 plus schools, colleges all across the valley and met about 7,000 students. Many of them, more than half of them, filled questionnaires that took them an hour to fill, which gave me tremendous insights. And I had realized by then that the established leadership, whether mainstream or separatist, and mainly separatist, had lost ground, had not didn't have much purchase with the new generation. And I keep saying that the militancy that began in 1988 ended around 2006. We've now been faced by a new generation of militants that took the field from about 2009-2010. Burhan Wani, who you mentioned, took up the gun in 2010, September, October, and he was a great motivator, and his influence in bringing a whole lot of young people from South Kashmir into militancy was huge. But also, let me say that more than Burhan, perhaps, Abu Qasim, who was a Pakistani, who was living in a village in Pulwama district for about 5 years, tilling a field, and his neighbors didn't know who he was or what he was. But he gradually brought the Lashkar back into action, and that made itself very obvious in about 2015. Now we've got a situation when Lashkar and Hizb, to which Hizbul Mujahideen, to which Burhan Wani belonged, have now both been upstaged, as it were, or have been relegated relatively to the back scenes by Jaish-e-Mohammed and Al-Badr and other such more radical.
Yeah, so David, Jaish-e-Mohammed has been responsible for some of the worst terror attacks in the Kashmir Valley. The attack on the Badami Bagh cantonment, the attack 99, the attack on the State Assembly, it was in 2001, where 25 civilians died as well.
Would you believe it? I passed the gate of the assembly half an hour before that attack.
Yeah, and now this, right? Now, the fact is, there are two elements to this. One is that the terrorist, the actual terrorist who carried out this strike, was a local boy. The second is that the Jaish-e-Mohammed, the group that has claimed responsibility, to which this Adil Dar was affiliated with, is a group that has haven in Pakistan. Which brings us back to the sort of perennial question is what India can do when Pakistan is under the world's nose harboring people like Masood Azhar and these militant outfits, and the links between them and the international arc of Islamist terror are only growing under the Pakistan government and military's nose. It means this is okay with them.
It does. And this is a very, very vexing situation and problem. I have been saying, and I gave a lecture about this at the Murti in 2011, that three strands, three prongs of security challenge to national security were emerging. One was the anger, the stone pelting, and the new militancy that was coming up in Kashmir. The second is Pakistan, and the third is China. And I said we should see more and more Pakistan in terms of the Sino-Pak axis, because it is China's backing that gives Pakistan the sort of boost or confidence to be able to do a lot of things. So does the nuclear weapon.
Right.
The Chinese attitude towards very, very prominent and well-known terrorist leaders like Masood Azhar is well known and is a problem. But what I've been saying since then, since about 2011, is that it is the youth in Kashmir, the new generation that is coming up and that has now come up and come of age and has been very radicalized in both political and religious terms. It is much easier for the state to deal with these youth and to reach out to them and to bring them around. And it's sad that much of the intervention by the state over the last several years, more than a decade now, has been either one to do with job creation or livelihood generation, or to do with clean government, better government, and again. Now, these youth who have taken to the field, and from 2010 it's been obvious that they are teenagers, they're schoolboys,
right,
largely, who are going into. And in fact, what strikes me is that people in their late 20s, who would normally be called youth, are relatively quiet. They're not taking up the gun, they're not pelting stones. No, it is teenagers who are. And so, teenagers are not affected by talk of livelihoods and jobs, etc. It's people in their 20s who look for those things. So, and also, people in the teens are not much bothered with clean government or with getting rid of corruption, etc. They are tangentially, to the extent that they're affected.
But I think on the policy front, I mean, since you're saying that this has been the approach to tackle, the sort of concerns about Kashmiri people in terms of job creation, better power supply, access to goods, travel back and forth, things like that. The fact of the matter is, on the policy front, when we talk about Kashmir, we are referring to a policy that could lead towards some sort of peace, lasting peace in the valley. So on that front, are you saying that whether it is the UPA or the current NDA government, successively, there has been a policy failure?
Yes, well, there have been policies, but what I'm saying is they've been inadequate policies. They've not approached the problem politically. They've not grasped the nettle. The real issue beyond all of this is to win over and to reach out to young people. And that needs to be done through education, through social media. Social media is where education takes place to a large extent.
Right, but the argument from here is that that's one part of the strategy, and that's sort of, what the army has always called winning hearts and minds of the people. That's one part of the strategy. The other is a really serious security concern, which requires, maybe according to Delhi, a hard state approach. But is that working? Because that's clearly led to, further alienation at one level as well.
Well, I'm not sure if there has been a hard state approach. In fact, I wrote an article last summer quoting both the army commander of the time and the corps commander of the time, saying that there is really no difference in our actions on the ground. Much of this has been words and phrases used in the public domain to talk about, to publicize what's happening in Kashmir. My sense is that, in fact, the army in the late 90s treated the Kashmir situation as a proxy war and was much more gung-ho in going all out to because many of the prominent militants in the field at that time were Pakistanis and Afghans, were Pakistanis from Lashkar and Afghans from Harkatul Mujahideen.
Yeah.
The current situation is such that it seems to me that the senior most army officers on the ground in Jammu and Kashmir are very concerned about reaching out to the youth. Okay. And trying to also train their troops and their officers not to alienate beyond a point. But of course, on the ground, that doesn't always work out.
Right. So just on that question of, the different kinds of approaches that could be put to use. I mean, what we have seen in the days since the Pulwama attack have also been very strong, measured reactions from the political front on one side, all political parties coming together, not politicizing this into a tutu meh kind of thing, but yet public anger being given the space to spill over, leading to a different kind of polarized climate, a vitiated climate, but broadly, taking away attention from where it should be, which is what can the state, the Indian state, do vis-a-vis Pakistan, vis-a-vis separatists, in order to find some sort of solution. Diplomatic isolation, tried that before, trying it again. Getting a world community together to censure Pakistan on its support for terror, trying that before, tried it before, trying it again. Reaching out to China, I don't know where we are on that. But the fact of the matter is, nothing has worked on the international front either. And, what are the options? Is there a military option on the table?
Two things. One, I wish there were a cogent and clear and consistent approach to Pakistan. What we've seen in the recent past is
flip-flops.
What I have described in writing in one of my articles as a flip-flop policy. You refuse to talk, or you refuse to let the Hurriyat talk to the High Commissioner, then you go and land there and talk. You need to have a consistent approach. For good or bad, Mr. Narasimha Rao, for the 5 years that he was Prime Minister, just ignored Pakistan. It just didn't exist. So there was a clear approach. Thereafter, Mr. Vajpayee also had a clear, consistent approach. He reached out both to Pakistan and to the Hurriyat leaders and to all comers to try and work out a peace agreement that would stick.
So on the Hurriyat, now the government has withdrawn security from 5 members, senior leaders of the All Parties Hurriyat Conference. Many are arguing this is too little, too late. I mean, the Hurriyat doesn't really have the teeth that it used to have. But do you think that that's a strong message?
I think it's a message, and with much of the messaging of the last few years, it's been a message for the country to assuage tempers which are running very high. But on the ground, one must understand that these were the moderate leaders who, in fact, cooperated in certain ways at certain stages. The Mirwais and Professor Abdul Ghani had gone to meet the Prime Minister, the Home Minister of the time, Mr. Advani, and were eager to try and resolve the issue in a way that could be sold to the people, as it were, and also could be lasting. And it is in that context that they were given security. And before that too, we must remember that assassinations have taken place, and I've talked about it in this book very clearly. Brought out how the Mirwais' father was assassinated, how Bilal Lone and Sajjad Lone's father was assassinated, and I've brought out very clearly what had happened in the 3 or 4 weeks before their assassinations, and how they had upset the Pakistanis in specific ways. And this is very clearly elucidated in this book.
Well, the Hurriyat also was riven with its own divisions within, in terms of the different members and factions within it. But
let me just add to that they were riven to the extent during the 90s. The Hurriyat Conference was formed in 93, but throughout the 90s and up to 2003 when the Hurriyat split, and at least until about 2000, the rest of the Hurriyat, or those who wanted to engage in negotiations, were scared of Mr. Gilani's hold. And you must remember that the assassinations have been carried out at the instance of Pakistan, and that they Hurriyat conference leaders who want to engage at various times in dialogue and in moving towards resolution are very aware of.
So do you think that this move to withdraw security really has any value today?
Not on the ground, because in the first place, not only the moderate leaders, and in fact I interviewed the Mirwais in 2015 when he said that we don't have much influence, we don't have influence with these young people, we did in the past. The fact is that these young people, the teenagers, and I've noted this in this book, The Generation of Rage, that young people today have lost confidence or faith in even Mr. Gilani, in all kinds of leaders. In fact, I was very struck by the fact that in 2017, I was in Pulwama and spoke to a large number of students at the degree college. And in the interaction, I asked, who is your hero? And they only talked about the Prophet. And there was, in fact, sullen silence
Which
for
is
a while.
of a huge concern, because
And I
that
said-
sort of Islamization is not something that, one saw in Kashmir in the early years of the insurgency.
Absolutely, but at least there was some of it there with the Hizbul Mujahideen. But now it's far more widespread among this generation. Not only that, I said anybody who's alive, and I even named people like Mr. Gilani, and there was no.
So we're out of time, so we'll have to wrap up. Number, what is your advice to Delhi in this time? Because we are, in the throes of an election season. We have seen the worst terrorist attack take place in Kashmir. There are mourning families across the country, not just in the valley.
The entire country.
The country is angry. Pakistan is brazening it out, as it has done in the past as well. What options does Delhi have right now?
Well, responses like these need to be very carefully thought out and can't be discussed in public. They must be very carefully thought out and then brought to bear. But the one thing that is clear and that needs to be the message for New Delhi is that there must be a consistent approach, whatever your approach. Whether it's Mr. Narasimha Rao's approach of just ignoring Pakistan, which he did for 5 years. There was no offer of talks or no reaching out. Or you can have Mr. Vajpayee's approach and reach out, and both could work to some extent at least, because by the time Mr. Narasimha Rao lost power, elections were held.
Back and forth
you
between
can't
the two.
keep doing this, that, and the other, and not know what your approach is.
All right, David Devdas, thanks very much for talking to us on this
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Extremely important issue at such a critical time. Thanks so much.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.